Hi everyone, and welcome to the last video of the employment cycle, and we are in our final phase, and that is the termination phase. So just remember, we've gone through the establishment phase, the maintenance phase, and now termination. So termination is where the employee leaves the particular workplace for many different reasons, ending the employment relationship. So it happens more regularly these days because people of your generation, I suppose, will change careers. So the research shows that you will change careers more often than what has happened in the past. Now there's four main reasons. There's lots of different reasons, I should say, for termination, for why people leave an organisation, but they can normally fit into these four categories. And they are retirement, resignation, redundancy, which can be voluntary and involuntary, which we'll go through in a second, and dismissal. So just beginning with retirement, pretty self-explanatory, but that occurs when an employee voluntarily leaves an organisation because they no longer want to be part of the labour force. Now, the organisation pays superannuation throughout their employment life, which in Australia it is a minimum of 9%, and it depends when they were born, when the person was born. Whenever they were born, that varies and changes the age at which the person can take their superannuation. And they can take the superannuation as long as you hit the age, which could be 54 and 8 months, it could be 60, or it could be 65, depending on when you were born. But once you take that, you're allowed to take that as long as you plan on retiring that day. Now, if that was your plan, and then the next day or a day later, if you decide that, no, I actually want to go back to work, then you can go and look for other employment. So it doesn't, just because you're retired doesn't mean you can't work ever again. As long as on the day that you retire, you are planning to actually retire, then you can take your superannuation. And then after that, you can go back to receive employment elsewhere or at the same organisation if you wish to. It's important that an organisation keeps track of the number of employees they have that are close to retirement, because if they have a large number, they need to plan for that. So they need to be developing their employees, so that succession planning, that's where HR planning is really important. Resignation, again, pretty straightforward, but that's where the employee voluntarily quits the job. So these two, in terms of retirement and resignation, that's where the employee volunteers to actually leave the organisation. Reasons can be many and varied, but it's important to actually find out what those reasons are, because it might find that they're not happy with the workplace. It might be that they're actually receiving higher pay or better working conditions elsewhere, that they're actually bored with their work. So if you find that, it's important to find the reasons out, and you might actually see a trend as a manager and see that, well, we've got quite a few people that are leaving because the conditions aren't quite as good here, whereas they're better elsewhere for the same kind of work that they're doing. So that's something then that you can try and fix to help retain your employees and reduce your staff turnover. Redundancy, that occurs when a person's job no longer exists. So the reasons for that, again, are many and varied, and that could be that there's technology changes so that a person's job no longer exists. Could be restructuring, could be poor financial performance, or it could be a merger where there would be duplication of resources, so that they want to achieve economies of scale and reduce their wage costs. So what happens is a package is given to the employee who's been made redundant. Size of the package depends on the years of service and what your pay's been over that journey. But you're offered a package to actually leave the organisation. Now, redundancy can be voluntary or involuntary. Now, voluntary redundancy, what happens is that an organisation decides that, all right, we're going to reduce, let's give an example and say they're going to reduce by 200 employees. The employees are notified of the job cuts, and then they're given the opportunity to nominate. So, they say, right, who wants to actually leave the organisation and take the package? And that's a lot easier because people may want to leave. They might be close to retirement age. They may have been thinking of going back to school. They may have been thinking of starting their own business, whatever reason. But some employers will actually put their hand up and go, yep, I actually want to take a redundancy package. Now, whatever's left, so let's say there was 200 employees that they want to reduce, so those that are leaving their jobs, and let's say 100 took voluntary redundancy The other 100 would participate in involuntary redundancy. So that's where, if there's cuts still required after voluntary redundancy has occurred, employees are then tapped on the shoulder and asked to leave. Now, they still get a package, but they're employees that probably want to keep their job and they've been told that, no, sorry, you're being made redundant. Dismissal. There's two types of dismissal, but first of all, dismissal is where the organisation terminates the employment due to unacceptable behaviour or poor performance. So, summary dismissal, that's where an employee commits a serious breach of their contract, so that's the most serious form of dismissal. They can be dismissed immediately, so it could be that they've turned up drunk to work, that they've stolen from the organisation, anything like that. Dismissal on notice is where an employee isn't performing their job satisfactorily, so what happens is they're given notice. Now, that notice is varied, but often it will be 3 strikes. So they get on the 3rd strike, that's enough, they're out. For notice to take effect, though, it's important that actual paperwork is written up. So if they're given written warnings, it's not just a warning that says, hey, don't do that again. It's actually written, and otherwise the employer can say, no, I never received any warning, I never signed anything, I was never given any disciplinary action or anything like that. So it's important that if you're going to dismiss someone on notice, that those warnings that are given need to be written down, and the employer needs to be aware of where they've gone wrong and what they need to do to improve. Now, there's unfair dismissal. It's a little bit harder these days to prove unfair dismissal than it was, and as employer relations changes, unfair dismissal also changes, but essentially an employee can't be dismissed for discrimination reasons, and they never can be. Now, that could be absence from work due to illness, it could be belonging to a trade union or in a strong unionised place, it could be unfair dismissal would be dismissed because you don't belong to a trade union, and then the normal discrimination such as race, sexual preference, gender, race, disability, and all those kind of things. So that's unfair dismissal. Just to recap, the termination phase, we have retirement, resignation, redundancy, and dismissal. And for questions and activities to help revise for this video, go to teachingbubble.com.